When was the last time you sat down and thoroughly enjoyed a serious poem by a poet who is still alive? If you aren't a poet yourself and you're watching this, it's almost certain that your answer is never, or at least not in a long, long time. So, where did such poems go? And for those who are poets, why are the poems that you see on social media and winning top honors so different from the poems that were written in the past? In short, what happened to great poetry? Now, this is a very big question, and in order to answer it, we have to take a long view. We have to go back, in fact, to the 19th century. Now, this is a time where we start to see a lot of new ideas in Europe. First and most importantly, we have the research of Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, who both independently developed the idea of natural selection, theorizing that man evolved from apes. Later, the sociologist Herbert Spencer applied these ideas to society, coining the term survival of the fittest. Also in England, Karl Marx was developing his economic theories that modern man was becoming the tool of industrial forces, and arguing that the capitalist system driving these forces needed to be overthrown. Over in Germany, Friedrich Nietzsche was writing about the death of God and how people needed a new system of values organized around the Übermensch or Superman, the superior individual who is beyond good and evil. Sigmund Freud was laying people on couches and probing early childhood memories, and based on this, he formulated the theory that people's behaviors are rooted in unconscious desires, specifically sexual impulses. Now, when you look closely at these theories, what you find is that they're all more or less incompatible. Herbert Spencer's social Darwinism was taken up by cutthroat free market capitalists. Marx obviously led to communism. Nietzsche didn't actually have a coherent political theory at all, but his idea of the Superman was appropriated by Hitler and the Nazis. What they do have in common is that they all demystified the world. They led Westerners to become disenchanted or disillusioned with the old religious worldview that provided a more comprehensive explanation of how things are. Now, none of these thinkers, except for Darwin, were particularly well known when they were writing, but in the 20th century, their ideas really took off. Now, how did this happen? Well, the short answer is World War I. The First World War was so terrible, so far beyond what anyone had ever seen in terms of its destructiveness, that it caused a lot of people to become very cynical. The war opened up this Pandora's box, and all of these new ideas flowed out and completely upended the old order of things. Now, what does all of this have to do with poetry? Well, actually, a lot. Because some of these disillusioned people looked at what was happening in English poetry over the last 500 years, and they thought it was time for a change. The 20th century was a new century. It was a new world that didn't see the need to write poetry the way that poetry had been written in the past. And this is where we get modernism. The father of this movement, Ezra Pound, made it his explicit mission to break the iambic line, referring to iambic pentameter, the form first used by Geoffrey Chaucer in the 14th century and continued in the works of Shakespeare and William Wordsworth. Pound and the other modernists looked to Walt Whitman, who himself embraced a Darwinist philosophy in his own poetry. And if we fast forward 100 years later to now, we see the fruits of this development, or rather, the rot. Self-absorbed, narcissistic poets who only ever write about themselves, verse that exhibits no craft, that just drones on about identity politics and subcultures and phantom racism. Poetry that, in short, is very boring, and that no one cares about. We're not seeing any new developments here. It's a dead end. Sure enough, if we trace it back, the demystification that launched this whole dead-end track has now proven to be woefully wrong, or at least questionable. Communism and fascism proved disastrous toward a basic sense of human kindness, killing millions, even today in China. Darwinian evolution has never shaken serious scholarly challenges to its fundamental premises. Even further back along the materialistic line of scientific reasoning, 17th century Newtonian physics has been upended by the iceberg tip of quantum physics. Simply put, there's a lot more to reality, to the meaning of life, and to the creation of the universe than what is in your science textbook. From the perspective of poetry, what can be done about this? As it turns out, there is another alternative tradition in American poetry that does not follow this post-demystification route. If the present trends in poetry we see in the academies today began with Whitman and Pound, this other tradition begins with the fireside poets. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the most celebrated of these figures, author of such poems as Paul Revere's Ride, Evangeline, and The Song of Hiawatha, didn't seek to make a radical break with the European literary tradition. He drew on the old forms to do new things. He used the meter from the Finnish epic, the Kalevala, to write the Song of Hiawatha in trochaic tetrameter. He wrote Evangeline in dactylic hexameter, the meter that ancient Greek and Latin poets used a lot, but which hadn't really been done in English. Although he was a traditionalist, Longfellow was also an innovator, and he was recognized as great in his own lifetime. Unlike Whitman, Longfellow was internationally famous. But in the 20th century, Ezra Pound was so influential that Longfellow and his way of doing things all got thrown out. One of the few exceptions was Robert Frost, who, not surprisingly because he ignored modernism, is the only 20th century American poet who is read by normal people. Now, the most common argument against writing formal traditional verse, which is something you may have heard, is that it's all been done before. It's old-fashioned. Now, technically, this is not wrong. Obviously, a lot of people have written sonnets in the past and still write sonnets today. But it is a misguided view, and I hope that this brief historical analysis shows you why. The fact of the matter is, there was never a point when the old forms became exhausted, where they hit a brick wall and became dead forms. People simply stopped practicing them. Meters and rhyme schemes and stanzas can be developed and changed and recombined in an infinite number of ways. And the writers published on the Society of Classical Poets website are proving that this is so, working within the long tradition promoted by the fireside poets and those who came before them. And if you explore the website, you'll encounter some of the innovative ways that the best formalist poets today are using rhyme and meter, pushing the boundaries of what is possible with traditional verse to do new things and to inspire the next generation.